Hello,
Thanks.
Bob. I'm Lori.
Hi, Lori.
Hi. Nice to see you face to face. I'm just going to talk a little bit, brag a little bit about you, if I may. Our speaker, Dr. Robert Bonde, has a PhD in veterinary medical sciences from the University of Florida. He has dedicated 40 years of his career to studying manatees worldwide, including in the US, Belize, Cuba, South America, and Africa. He is a retired research biologist from the US Geological Survey Serenia Project. Throughout his career, Dr. Bonde has played a pivotal role in the conservation of manatees through stranding investigations, population monitoring, and longitudinal assessment of manatee health. Dr. Bonde has also worked as an adjunct professor at the University of Florida and has served on more than 30 graduate student committees.
Does he see something?
Over 100 scientific publications, and has co-authored with Dr. Roger Reep a book titled The Florida Manatee Biology and Conservation, which has just come out in its second edition.
Great. Thank you, Lori. And thank you, Paul and Eric. So I'm gonna share the screen now. Make sure that works. So let's see, I want to run this. And so which screen do you see right now? Do you see a screen, just the video screen, or do you see a markup, a display?
See you.
Paul,
Okay.
I think Robert needs to have administrative rights. You're muted, Paul.
Robert,
Yes.
I'm going to make you host. Do you know how to unhost yourself at the end of your presentation?
Yeah, I should be able to. Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to make you host.
Okay. And I'm gonna start this. And now, do you see my my slide?
No, not yet.
Not yet.
Not yet. Maybe I need to share it again. Let me.
Yeah, we go.
Okay, now you're working. Now we're working.
Yep.
Okay. So let me bring this up now, and you should see the slide.
Okay, yeah.
Is that correct?
Good.
Okay, sorry for the delay. So who am I? Well, I'm Bob Bonde, and I've been studying manatees for over 40 years. I worked with the federal government as a field biologist and learned most of what I know about the manatee kind of firsthand before a lot of the books were written and before a lot of the information and articles, scientific articles were published. I started at a time when we knew very little about the manatee. And we built on that. And since then, we've written quite a few scientific articles. We've written several books. We think we know a lot about the manatee, but they really don't cease to amaze me, because manatees, basically every day when I get up, I'm more excited to learn about what I'm going to learn today than what I knew yesterday. So it's an interesting topic in that there's so little we know about the manatee. Is everybody else muted okay? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I got started coming to Florida from California, and the first thing I had to do as a field biologist to learn about manatees was to basically get in the water and think about what makes them eat, breathe, and sleep, and do the things that they do. But first, I'm going to go back to the past. I'm going to talk a little bit about where manatees originated from. And if we look at manatees, we see that they started if we go back far enough, we go back 100 million years ago, we see that they were part of a family or group of animals called the Arthrotheria. And the Arthrotheria included elephants, hyraxes, aardvarks, and manatees. And so their trajectory through evolution started at this root with the elephant. And they basically, about 70 million years ago, moved into the water. They had 4 legs and they were terrestrial, but they went back into the water at that point, where elephants stayed on the ground. And they evolved into an aquatic species. And the aquatic species, about 41 million years ago, started to diverge into two groups. And so the present day sirenians consist of the dugongs and the manatees. Now, if we look at these, we see that there was one order, and manatees are so unique and different that they constitute their own biological order. But it also consists of 2 families, and those are the dugong and the manatee. And if we look closely at this drawing on the lower right, we can see that this large sirenian is called a stellar sea cow. It was very large. And if we look, we can see that the stellar sea cow occupied areas up around the Bering Sea where water was very cold. Whereas the rest of the sirenians were in a tropical line along the equator and evolved in tropical environments. So the dugongs and the stellar sea cow, which went extinct, the stellar sea cow went extinct a couple of hundred years ago, and were the Dugongidae. And the family for the manatees consisted of the other 3 individuals: the Amazonian manatee that lived in the Amazon, the African manatee that lived off the coast of West Africa, and the West Indian manatee that was from Florida all the way down to portions of Brazil. And one small group of the Antillean manatees is included in the Florida manatee that lives off the southeastern United States. So I guess this all accumulated with some of my experiences, and Roger and I wrote a book in 2006, the first edition, called The Florida Manatee Biology and Conservation. And then about 15 years later, we wrote the second edition. The second edition consists of double the pages. We have more experience now after 15 years, and we publish more information about the everyday life of the manatee. And a lot of this entails different stories and things of that sort. I don't make any profit off the book. All of the money and the proceeds from the book go back into research projects and graduate student awards so that they can continue to carry on this torch of doing research on manatees. So as a biologist, the first thing I had to do was don a mask, fins, and snorkel, and to learn about what the manatees were doing. And to do that, there was a great place called Crystal River, where the water is real clear. You can see the manatees up close. In fact, they can scrutinize you as well as you can scrutinize them. And with a weight belt, I could get into the water and drop down into their water column, into this other environment, where it immersed myself in senses that I wasn't really familiar with in a terrestrial world. You know, when we get in an aquatic world, it's very different to us. Sounds are attenuated through the water. The temperature gradients are more effective on the skin and those kinds of things. So it really kind of made you much more aware of what was going on. And it created this looking glass that let us, as a biologist, look into the wildlife species that are out there and see what basically constituted their needs and necessities for survival. And keep in mind, 40 years ago, when we first got in the water with manatees, we knew very little about manatees. And again, we were in kind of a mode where we could just basically build on the science that we were working on. So it was a great opportunity, and one that is very far and few between in today's world and age. So we have learned quite a bit about manatees. We know that in body size, they can be up to about 5 feet long and maybe 60 to 70 pounds, 80 pounds or more when they're born. An adult can be up to 10 feet in length and weigh basically over 1,000 pounds. The largest manatee we had was 3,600 pounds and was over 4 meters in length. So they can grow from very small to very large in their environment. Part of getting larger in your environment was what the dugong did with the stellar sea cow. The dugong stayed small in the tropics, but when the stellar sea cow evolved into a life in an aquatic environment off the Aleutian Islands where it's extremely cold, they got larger. And so our Florida manatee is, of course, larger than the West African or the Amazonian manatees that are out there in general. And females tend to be larger and heavier than their male counterparts of the same age because females are basically making calves. They need all of the resources necessary to be reproductive and active in developing and nurturing their offspring. We know from females there's about a 1 to 4 year calf dependency period where the calf will stay with the mother for that period. It's very critical. If the calf is separated from the mother and hasn't learned how to survive, its chances of surviving if it were rescued and placed back into the wild are low compared to an animal that is nurtured and raised and educated by its mother. Calves suckle from 2 axillary teats, one located under the 4 flippers of the manatee. We know that elephants do the same thing. Their teats are under their front legs, and there's one on each side, and so that single baby elephant can come up and nurse from its mother. Same thing true with the manatee, one of those characteristics that stayed with them over time. And suckling underwater lasts maybe 3 to 5 minutes duration, but it's constantly every couple of hours, especially in the newborn. And then as the calf gets larger, it starts to experiment and explore the environment around him and them, and basically take in other supplemental vegetation at that time, after about 2 weeks of life. So they really are starting to become tuned into the needs and necessities of the environment, as well as the nurturing from the mother. And the calving interval for that female would be every 2.5 to 3 years. So she'll produce 1 calf every 3 years. And like an elephant, manatees are long-lived. Manatees can live to be 50 or 60 years old. We know that from captive manatees. And that's similar to elephants. Elephants can be 70, 80 years old as well. So another characteristic that they share with their elephant heritage. Now, these aquatic mammals that got back into the water had to learn to hold their breath, of course. And to more effectively do that, they maintained a horizontal position in the water. And this was level so that their lungs, if we look at this drawing, we see their lungs are along the long axis of their body. And that's not because they're leaping straight up and down like people, where our diaphragm is horizontal to our body axis at our mid-body. Here it's along the long axis of their body, so they could stay stretched out and lengthy in the water. They have a large gut, they're hindgut fermenters, and a large digestive tract that's designed for processing their food. They're semi-social in groups, but basically the primary bond is between the cow and the calf, and everybody else is just usually associated or affiliated with things in the environment that they share in common. And they have very pachyostotic dense bone, and this dense bone in their body gives them ballast in the water. So all of this digestive tract that produces gas makes you more buoyant. If you're floating at the surface and can't get down to where the grass is, you're gonna starve to death. So having this essentially a weight belt in their natural makeup allows them to work on the challenges of dealing with buoyancy issues in the environment. Another thing they have is rostral deflection. And this, if we look at the skull on the left, this is a West African manatee. If we look at the skulls in the middle, these two are West Indian manatees, the Florida manatee on the right, and the Antillean manatee on the left. And we look at the dugong. Now we see that these rostral deflections are quite different. This rostral deflection is flat with the axis of the body. And that's so that the manatee in the Amazon, where the water is very turbid and dark, can feed on floating vegetation that's right at the surface. So they don't have to bend their body like a dugong would to grab it at the surface. They can stay floating and maintain their horizontal position in the water. West Indian manatees are intermediary, but look at the dugong. That dugong is so exaggerated and different that they're designed for going down to the bottom and dredging along the bottom to dig up rhizomes and things that are plants that are growing in the water. So the dugong is more effective at grazing and hoeing down deep in the water, whereas the West African manatee is a surface dweller, and the intermediary groups can do the surface, the middle, and the bottom, which is our manatee from Florida, pretty specialized. So basically their traits, they're herbivorous, they're generalists. They can feed on just about any kind of plant that's out there. they'll consume about 5 to 10% of their body weight. So if we have a 3,000-pound manatee, that's an extraordinary amount of vegetation that manatee will process over time. And they have a prehensile use of their facial vibrissae during feeding. That means that they can use those whiskers on their face to grab things. And I learned this because I have 3 swimsuits. I have a yellow one, and when I go swim in the water with manatees, they'd ignore me because it flops in the water and it's yellow. I have a blue pair and they flop in the water and it's yellow, and yellow and the blue, they ignore that. But I have a green pair, and the green pair look like leafy vegetation. And these manatees literally will come up and try to grab my swimsuit from me and pull it off with these prehensile lips on their snout, or they think they're getting a meal out of this. So it's very, it was another kind of interesting way. Once you are visiting in their environment, you're sharing the rules of engagement with manatees under those kinds of circumstances.
Excuse me, Bob. Bob,
yes.
excuse me for a second. I'd like to ask all those to please put yourself on mute. Gigi, Marianne, if you can do that. Thank you.
Yeah, fantastic. And so they have a long gut transit time. And this means that when they take in food in the mouth, it takes about 7 days to pass through the GI tract, that long intestine. You know, our large intestine is 4 feet long. A manatee's large intestine is up to 20 to 30 meters long. So that's 60, 70 feet. So they have a much larger processing time spent in the GI tract. And it takes 7 days for that food that once it's entered the mouth to go out the other end. And that's so that they can draw as much nutrient from the vegetation as possible. They have continual tooth replacement too. And this is really important if you're feeding on seagrass that's in sandy, gritty material. If you only have molars and your molars wear out like an elephant and you have a finite number, you die of old age through starvation. Well, manatees have molars, but they developed a mechanism of hind molar progression where the teeth work from the back of the jaw to the front. And as they work forward, they wear flat and thin. So a manatee in its 70 years of life will have an unlimited supply of teeth throughout its whole life. And that's what makes sirenians and manatees very unique and different. Another thing that's different about them are their brains. And if we look at the brain here of a dolphin at the top and a manatee down at the bottom, the dolphin brain is larger, but the manatee brain is pretty large, about the size of a grapefruit. But it's lysodelphic. It doesn't have convolutions like our brain and dog brains and dolphin brains. It's flat and smooth. And neuroanatomists in the early days didn't equate that with intelligence. But it turns out that manatees, like these 2 individuals here, the manatee and the dolphin, have 2 different lifestyles that demand 2 different things. The dolphin has to be effective using echolocation it can process in its brain to locate a target fish and catch it and eat it, whereas a manatee doesn't have to echolocate to find vegetation in the water. What does it have to do? It has to remember where the food is. And we use an adage, an elephant never forgets. Well, when the neuroanatomists looked at the brains of the dolphin and the manatee, they found the manatee had a very great cognitive ability where it could remember things through rote memorization and training and education. And this is that process where the mother teaches the calf learns from its experiences, it gets weaned from the mom, it goes out and meets other manatees, they all learn from each other, and they kind of pass on the strategies for survival. So manatees are very unique in that regard. They have this large GI tract and gut system that requires them to remember where to find the food and remember where to find the water to drink, because they're not completely marine adapted. A marine adapted animal like a dolphin or a dugong can drink salt water. A Florida manatee and a manatee has to drink fresh water or have a freshwater source. Their kidneys are like camel kidneys, and they're essentially a camel in the desert looking for water when they're out in the ocean looking for freshwater sources. And we also know that their vision is very poor. If we look at the vision here on a scale, we see that a human is right about here on the scale. A dog is a little worse than a human because it doesn't have to read the Wall Street Journal. Frogs and legally blind come in right about here. A cow is here. An Amazonian river dolphin that we know is technically blind, doesn't use his eyes because the water is so dark and turbid. And then we have manatees that are in this spectrum of almost to complete blindness. So this was kind of interesting and a funny challenge, because we thought, well, you know, to us being terrestrial, we rely so much on our eyesight. Manatees don't have echolocation abilities like that dolphin has. So they can't probably hear sounds detected off of clicking noises that bounce off of objects in the water. The vision is very poor. So if they're not using these beady little eyes to see things, and they probably do use them when they're as kind of like an artificial horizon on an airplane, an instrument that you would read to tell if you're up or down when you're in cloudy areas, which you don't know when you're flying through the air very fast, it gives a reference to the manatee. But more importantly, they probably explore things with this prehensile snout and the whiskers on its face. We know the mouse has this, and cats and dogs have this. A mouse has whiskers that come off, and whenever you see a mouse run, it doesn't run across the room if it doesn't have to. It runs along the wall, and it's because it can take its whisker and run the whisker on a radiation along the side of the board, the baseboard, to get so it doesn't bump into anything out in the open. Well, manatees have whiskers on their face, but all other mammals have whiskers on their face except for a small shrew that lives in pitch black environment, has them on its forearms. And the manatee, when we tried to determine what their hairs were doing, we looked at the density of hairs in their body. And we noted that here's their head and their eye, and their tail is back here. And there was more hair associated with the back than with the underside or the ventral side. And this is so that they have more hairs on their blind side. So we hypothesized that maybe they could see, literally feel tactfully whiskers that may be on their body. And sure enough, when we looked at those histologically, we saw that the primary whiskers, the secondary whiskers on the face, and then these pledge hairs that are on the body about 1 centimeter apart or 1 inch apart all over the body are actually hairs that are tactile, and they can feel through this bladder, this membrane that's sheathed along the side of the hair follicle. It relays information to the brain. And we noticed that the neuron density between the whiskers and the face was almost 40% of their ability to process in the brain. So there's a lot invested in whisker and whisker mechanics with the manatee. The rest of it is doing other things, that coordination and communication. They make vocalizations. They make a little squeak. It goes beep, 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 beep. When they're swimming through the water, the cow and the calf can understand who's making which noise. And so you might have 2 calves in a tank and 2 adult moms and the mothers, and one calf, you pinch it and it squeaks, and the mother, both mothers hear it and they look and they try to respond, and one looks over and says, well, it's not my calf, good thing, goes back to sleep. The other one goes right to the calf, and they can home in on these squeaking sounds as they're swimming closer to each other. It's really quite phenomenal how they can do this. And it helped us to understand maybe how they could do boat avoidance and other things, where maybe the hearing, they don't hear through the vibration of the dense bone on their body as much as they can detect sounds and vibrations in the water using hairs on their body. Pretty phenomenal. So the life history of the manatee, they'll give reproductive interval of manatees is about 2.5 years. They'll give birth to 1 calf. Twins occur, but only in about 1.6 or 7% of the time. So twins are rare, just like they are in elephants. And they'll nurse at the teats located under the foreflippers. And so that calving interval of 2 to 0.5 years gives them a gestation of about 1 year. So they'll go through a cycle of getting pregnant, 1 year later giving birth to the calf, and then either 1 or 2 years later weaning the calf off and then getting pregnant again. So every 3 years they'll essentially produce 1 calf. And that process works out fairly well, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in their reproductive strategy over survival and estimates. But if we look at this, A Florida manatee's survival estimate for an adult is about 97%. So if you had 100 manatees in your family, say off Cape Coral, and that population next year came back, you'd probably have 97. Now that's unfortunate, but here's the key. If you have 50% male and 50% female, and about 30% are reproductively of age, and another 20% are juveniles or younger. And of your 30, if you're giving calving interval of once every 3 years, you've got 10 animals giving birth. And so you may come back with, instead of 97, you'll come back with 107. And this kind of gives us an idea now of how manatees can deal with perturbations and things that are going on around them, and how they've been kind of successful in coexisting with people, as long as we keep those rules of engagement right and we don't overburden manatees with other issues that are out there. Now, manatees, we know when it gets cold, because they're tropical, have to find warm water, and they do it in artificial sources of discharge of warm water plants, which is very common, or discharge canals that come out of power plants where the water's been heated up, or places that are natural, like here's in Crystal River, where artesian spring water boils up out of the ground. It is heated and treated by Mother Earth and brought to the surface for manatees to provide for them in the winter. Unfortunately, we deprived manatees of going in those areas 100 plus years ago, when we would prize them for putting them in the stew pot. So if a manatee came into a spring and we liked to live there and we ate the fish and the manatee occasionally swam in, we probably killed it, put it in the stew pot. So manatee survival was dampened pretty much, and numbers were depressed when people came into the picture for manatees in Florida. And manatees were around about probably 10 to 15,000 years ago in Florida, about the same time humans came in and started to occupy the peninsula southeastern United States. So to learn about manatees, we had to give them an ID, and we did that with individual identification of manatees, and unfortunately it was using propeller marks and scars on their bodies so we could identify the individual. And we have a catalog. It's called the Manatee Individual Photo Identification System. And it marks the number of manatees where we have these mug shots or these complete documented photographs of the manatee. And we can match that like a fingerprint for when we re-sight it again or next time we see it. And of that catalog, we have over 5,000 manatees right now. So when I started working with manatees, there were maybe 60 manatees in Crystal River. We thought maybe there were 700, 800 in the state. And these were estimates. But right now we have 5,000 individuals in our active catalog. And what's unique about that catalog is, here's an example. We got a picture of a manatee. And this was a manatee in Mexico in 2021. The head's down here. And so if I flip it and I put the head up here and I look at this scar right here on the manatee, we ran it through our catalog and we got this sighting. And this is another manatee that the picture was taken. This is a manatee called Moon. It's a famous manatee we put a radio tag on. This manatee carried a radio tag in Florida for probably 15 years and taught us a lot about some of the habitat and places in Florida that were important to this animal. And this was taken back in 2021, and this was in 1985. So this animal that was a Florida resident left Florida for some reason and migrated to Mexico. And we think what is happening is density dependence, and the number of manatees in Florida is getting larger, that some manatees are choosing to disperse into the environment. And some are going as far as Mexico, some go to the Bahamas, some go up along the Atlantic seaboard. They're starting to move into other areas. If climate change takes effect, as habitat warms outside of the extraliminal wandering of manatees into those areas, manatees are going to start taking up occupancy in other areas too. So this dispersal is a normal event that takes place. When it gets warm, the population gets big. When it gets extremely cold, and the polar ices come back, it gets cold and the population constricts back down to the tropical equator line. So that's been kind of the scenario for the manatees. But we also know that there are other factors that could have caused the movement of some of these animals. I'm going to talk about those in a minute too. So think about Moon that lived on the east coast of Florida and chose to go to Mexico.
Bob, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
You had mentioned earlier that they're freshwater animals,
Uh-huh.
and that they don't do well in salt water. So how do they migrate through, the ocean and the
Yeah.
Gulf?
No, that's a great question. And, they have these kidneys are like camel kidneys, and the camel can travel long distances without getting a drink of water. And it'll go literally for days, if not weeks. And then it'll find a water source and it'll drink for, 25 gallons at a standing, take it through and start urinating immediately to excrete the toxic salts that it has. So we think that manatees having these camel-like kidneys give them the ability to bridge some of these distances. Now, most of them are probably victim of dispersal by current. So if you're a manatee, and I don't know a manatee that's not, I wouldn't say lazy, but a manatee that doesn't take the easiest way to get from point A to point B, even though it may be longer, they'll do that. And so they're using currents, and the currents put them out. In fact, they think that there were manatees in Florida and in the Caribbean. And when a holistic event upheaval took effect, the water got fresher in the Caribbean. And this was about 1.5 million years ago. And the water skimmed at the surface along the Atlantic Ocean and followed the current to Africa. And we think that manatees followed floating mats of vegetation from the Caribbean to the continent of Africa. And that's how our manatees got from this hemisphere into the other hemisphere by making these long distance travels. Now, there could be expense. For every one that goes out and makes it, 2 or 3 don't, but we're going to have to follow those numbers and see what the case is. So I think a manatee, I could guess if it had fresh water, it probably weekly goes to get fresh water. If you stress a manatee, I would assume it could go potentially a month or more, maybe 6 weeks without water, because they have reserve built in and these kidneys that allow them to not get too toxic.
Thank you.
So in Crystal River, we see, when I started, it was back here in '78, there were probably 50 or 60 manatees in Crystal River. The number and the trend have been going up over time. So that's a good sign. And this is through 2015. It's even greater now. So in Crystal River, where there were 50 or 60, now there's over 1,000. So a trend is here that's pretty apparent. And so we want to know the current status of the manatee. And if people want to know how many there are, and when we fly a survey, it's difficult to ascertain. If we look at Crystal River from the air, it's not all clear water. This was water hyacinth that was up at the surface. So this is vegetation columns in the water that come all the way to the surface in about probably 7 or 8 feet of water. If a plane flew over, it'd count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 manatees. Okay, they'd write 5 down and they'd fly to the next spot. Well, if a swimmer came in and swam in here and went by these 5 manatees, they would go along the edge and they would hear this. And these are manatees that are underneath this stuff that have chewed caverns into the vegetation that they were eating on. So it's essentially making them uninstructed from view from the air. And we think that that's part of the problem, because in aerial surveys, not all the areas are clear water like Crystal River. They're turbid water. So you only get a manatee when it's at the surface to take a breath. Well, a manatee can hold its breath for 1 to 2 minutes while it's traveling, 5 to 10 minutes while it's sleeping, and some have held their breath for over 20 minutes. So if you're in an airplane flying over dark water, you can't wait for 20 minutes to count the manatee as it comes to the surface and keep track of other manatees that are coming up in between. It's a very difficult thing to do. But people still want to know, how many manatees are there? And that question, to our best guesstimate using synoptic surveys, using a model that predicted, was about 6,620, the last publication. This was back in 2018. Well, we're going to bounce ahead a little bit. And from our synoptic survey, we see that the trend here of being close to 2,000 doubles in about 15 years, and then doubles in another 15 years. So in this period from 91 to 2016, we probably went from close to 2,000 manatees up to 6,000 in the doubling process. So that works, and it's pretty much 15 to 16 years the population continues to double, but every year more and more deaths take place. And in fact, the estimates for 2020 place the manatee population today somewhere around 7,000 to 10,000. So that's optimistic. And we're happy that that's the case, you know, that we know that the biological capabilities of manatees would allow them to do that. But what's more significant than the biological capabilities of anything to do anything is the ability of perturbations by humans and our activities that could stunt that type of development and growth in the population. So we do health assessment checks on them, and we do them in Crystal River, and we can go out in boats and catch manatees and pull them up onto a boat like this boat with a net that's deployed off the back. It has no transom, and the manatee slides up onto the back. That's how they rescue manatees today, or we do health assessments on them. Or we also catch them in like Crystal River using nets that we deploy. We collapse the net into shore, we pull the manatee up onto the shore, and then a team does the health assessment on the manatee. And here they're implanting a pit tag like you would in your pet dog for re-identification later. They're also using getting oral temperature so we can see how warm the manatee is and make sure we get enough water on the animal. Where they're drawing blood, they're taking heart rate so we can monitor all of these vital signs while they're out of the water. And they're doing morphometrics. They're measuring lengths and girths and things of that sort so that we can see nutritionally how well they're doing. We also do ultrasound checks to measure the amount of subcutaneous fat layers and blubber layers that are underneath the skin. But occasionally, those animals that we pull out, we put a radio tag on, and this is with a non-invasive belt that goes around the tailstock with a semi-rigid tether, and that allows the tag to float off behind the manatee. The system works really well. We've used it since the late 70s, and it's an extremely good way to get information on manatees. And in fact, once we've got those manatees tagged, they teach us. We learn about it. And so we basically, they're instructing us on what's going on that's important in their lives. And then we're applying that into publications so that the managers can take that information and make logical decisions about how to deal with it. So here's an example of down in Port of the Isles. We tagged a manatee here. And over this period of just a few weeks, the manatee did this stuff. And it moved from Port of the Isles where fresh water was, and it went out to the areas along here where the seagrass beds are, but we didn't know how it got from point A to point B. So what we did was that at the same time that these satellite tags were generated using a PTT tag, a platform terminal transmitter tag, we put a GPS tag on. And we've all know how phenomenal GPS tags are. If we're driving our car, or they can instruct us which lane to be in on the interstate, and blah, blah, blah. It's amazing. Well, this is what the data looks like when GPS throws it back to us. And that same data, this is the same individual doing this stuff with the old system of tracking, now gives us information like this. And now we know that this animal that left Port of the Isles went this way, or used this canal or this channel, but didn't use other areas. And so speed zones now to a manager can be have a better efficacy if they can take information like this and decide which areas are important to protect and to preserve and to put in speed regulation zones, and what portions of the seagrass beds are they using. All of these kinds of things start to play into that picture that's helping build our knowledge of base for making these decisions about their long-term survival. Another manatee that we put a radio tag on back in the 80s was an animal called sea cow. We had a radio tag, and this radio tag was blue at the top and it had a C on it. So we went and caught a manatee, picked the tag up and said, sea, this is sea cow. So we named him Sea Cow, and Sea Cow was a female from Brevard County, which is the east coast of Florida, near the Kennedy Space Center. And this animal started to give birth, and she taught us a lot about gestation She taught us a lot about calf dependency for the East Coast. And she had a calf. And so her first calf, we pulled the tag off the shelf and it had a D on it. And we put it on her calf. And so it was a reddish tag. And so we had, here's C cow and here's D cow. And now we have a mother and a calf. And this really started to teach us about calf dependency and the weaning process that took place. This mother and this calf stayed inseparable for a year and a half. And then in the second year, it started to wean apart, and it weaned very abruptly. In fact, she left her home site of site fidelity that was very small, just a few miles. She went up in almost to the Georgia border. And then she left D cow up there and she raced back down. She got pregnant again. And the D cow eventually came back down and went to all of the haunts, all the places that C cow taught that baby to go to when it got cold, or where to get the fresh water, or where it would need to go to feed. And D cow was mirroring those same timed movements. But the critical thing was D cow was doing it independently of C cow. When C cow went and left Brevard County and went down to Fort Lauderdale to overwinter, D cow stayed in Brevard County, but 2 weeks later left and was within 50 feet of C cow in the middle of the winter. So it was it instructed us how important this memorization is, and this teaching and training that the cows and the calves have to go through. That's similar to what elephants train their young to meet the challenges in the environment as well. So behaviors that we've learned from these animals is they're semi-social. Only the cow and the calf have an inseparable bond. They might have migrations that can involve a site fidelity range that's 5 miles in circle. 2, individuals that will use the whole Atlantic seaboard. In fact, some will even go even farther than that. They'll go all the way to Massachusetts. Like Chessie was released, I think yesterday or today. And Chessie was a manatee that we caught in the mid-90s up in Chesapeake Bay. We went up and caught Chessie, brought him back down to Florida, patted him on the back, gave him another break, flew him down on an airplane, put him in Florida waters, and the next summer went right back up to Chesapeake Bay and went further up into Massachusetts. So Chessie was another trainer that told us what we think and perceive of what we think manatees should be doing. Chessie showed us what they do. And we couldn't believe what some of the things we were seeing these animals do. It's pretty phenomenal. They also, when they come in and their new animals come in, they often greet and they press their muzzle up against each other. And we don't know if this is chemosensory or tactile or some communicative effort that helps them to recognize individuals within maybe their own social groups or clans or family units. We really don't know. And so I think I've learned a lot about manatees, but there's still gobs of information out there that we can learn about manatees, and books that will be written on manatees that, again, won't cease to amaze us. Reproduction that they have involves a mating herd. The female goes into estrus, and all the males, consorting males in the group, come in and follow her around and try to breed with her. In fact, this could have been one of the mechanisms that if your population, it gets so dense and there's too many males, the animals like Moon might decide to leave and go somewhere else. I'm going out into the frontier. And Moon, I don't know if it went directly across following the currents. There are times when the Gulf current goes in the opposite direction, and it would have easily taken her from tip of South Florida to Mexico. Or she went up along the whole Gulf Coast, along Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, and back down into Mexico. We don't know. We didn't have a radio tag on her. She was tagged in Mexico, but a crocodile pulled the tag off just within 2 weeks being down there. So the perils of being a manatee, you have to deal with people and crocodiles and alligators. So feeding, they're herbivorous, they're generalists. That's a good thing. As long as there's plenty of seafood or vegetation out there, may not be the case right now, but there are carrying capacity issues that could be involved with this. And the threats that manatees have, threats primarily are from interactions with boats, and that's a major problem that manatees have. There's a change of habitats that have been evolved over time, so boats are a problem, Industry is a problem, and pollutants in the water. Overdevelopment of areas can be a problem, and boats that use the waterways, the same roads that essentially manatees use to get from point A to point B. So as those highways get congested with boats, it makes it more difficult to manatees to find effectively safe ways to get to the surface to take a breath of air. So the ecosystem and manatee habitat is a complex organism, basically. It's changing, and as it does, manatees do pretty well. They evolve along with humans very well, in fact. They're not like a condor. If you look at a condor, the egg will crack. I mean, they're so sensitive, but manatees are plugging away and dealing with issues. And actually, maybe it's because of this intellect that they have. They have the ability to try to rational and understand and think about things that are going on. They make good habitats with the environment, as long as we don't overindulge ourselves with what's going on. And if we do too much of that, and we don't have enough space at the surface for them to effectively get up and get that breath of air that they need, or find the fresh water that they need to drink, or get to the seagrass beds that are out there, then we're going to have a problem. And that's why we're trying to learn about that. So a manatee pandemic, is it possible? Well, something's going on right now, but it's not COVID-19. And we can relate to a pandemic. We know the measures we had to take to be careful. Manatees are facing a similar situation, with over 800 manatees this year have died in the area of Florida's central eastern coast. And this was around the habitat that in Brevard County that was destructed. And the destruction of that habitat occurred in 2011, when there was a big hazardous algal bloom. It killed a few fish, but mainly it killed some of the seagrasses that were there, and it knocked them back almost 80–90% of the virgin seagrass that was in the Indian and Banana rivers in Brevard County are gone. And now manatees have come back in high numbers, and there isn't enough for them to eat. So we really think that quality of and the carrying capacity has been so hampered and impacted that manatees are literally coming and dying of starvation, which leads to malnutrition, and is also maybe stimulated by cold during the winter. So from January to now, we've had over 800 deaths. And if our trajectory from last year, which put us at a pace of about 500 to 600 deaths per year, we'd be at about 300 right now. So this is going to be a really bad year for manatees, to say the least. And we need to understand what's going on with that system and make sure that we can provide enough stable habitat for future manatee use into the next 21st century or into the future. And we do that because manatees can't advocate for themselves. They need us to do that. And so we have to become advocates for manatees by understanding their treatments, their threats, and their problems, and then trying to do something about that. And that's why it's great to brand yourself with Friends of Wildlife. We really, if we're going to have wildlife around and manatees for future generations to enjoy, we need to be good stewards of that environment. We need to make sure that it's healthy and it's significant out there. So management conservation issues, they've changed over the years, but we started with the Marine Mammal Protection Act, which protects manatees. We had the Endangered Species Act in 1973, which put them on and classified them as endangered. We had the Florida Manatee Recovery Plan, which was a plan that was initiated to kind of help bring the numbers back. And it was based on a status review, stock assessment, and what constituted critical habitat. All these are good words, and this is the model that we should use, but it falls short when you have a pandemic and you don't have enough critical habitat for the population to use. You've fallen short of what needs to be done. And about 3 years ago, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, reclassified the manatee to threatened. So they're threatened now, and they're not endangered. And what does that mean? Well, it means that one, they're not giving as much money for research right now to understand what's going on with manatees, but we're chasing the ambulance in this situation. The ambulance are those recovered carcasses in Brevard County and other places with mortality continuing to go up, how are we doing the right kind of management when that tends to be the case? And we need to understand this. We need to be advocates for this. We need to go to Tallahassee. We need to go to Washington, D.C. and lobby for manatees, because they're not going to ride in a bus up to D.C. and Tallahassee and tell them what they need. We need to understand that. We need to educate ourselves. We need to learn about it. So in the future, you know, we've got, here's manatee winter use of manatee units, management units in Florida. And we have the southeastern, we have the southwestern unit, and then we have the whole East Coast unit, and then we have the St. Johns River unit. And there are natural sources of fresh water in here. These are natural too. And we have the artificial sources of warm water, the red ones. And then we have some passive ones, and they're mostly down in the Everglades. Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings used a phrase, the Everglades River of Grass, you know, and it was a river, but it was also a solar convection system that manatees probably used before people came into the picture. And they used that heated water in the Everglades. Well, we have an Everglades now, but it's not what it used to be. So we've supplemented with these artificial sources of warm water, pushing the manatee population further north. And maybe we're having an impact associated with that that might be detrimental, because if we lose these and we lose these, then manatees are only going to be able to have to survive on what's left, and that would be these kinds of things. So these management units are going to shrink down into more concise locations. There's going to be more distance between the outliers and the north part of this range. But I kind of look at it like you've got an eye here and an eye here and a happy smiley face, because the manatees are out to evolve. They're going to do what it takes to survive, and they're going to do their best. It's just if they can keep pace with what's going on, and it happens, then we need to ensure that there's quality out there and not just quantity. If we have a power plant loss, we're going to have a population size loss in Florida. We need to expect that. And more isolation potential will likely lead to specialization. So manatees that are down here are going to have to learn where to find the fresh water. They've got the fresh water up here. They need to find the seagrasses. They've got all fresh water here. They need to find freshwater vegetation and plants. We need to keep all that stuff healthy for them if we're going to have that carrying capacity. So in the future, you know, we want manatee populations to look like this. We want them to have active, healthy, happy lives. We want it to be done in clean water. So water quality isn't an issue. If it looks like this, we wouldn't drink it. But if it's clear, we'll drink it, but it may not be as healthy as this stuff, you know, because of the microorganisms and the chemicals that are in the water. So we need to make sure that we clean up our pollution and make it a cleaner place for manatees. So you end the talk with a sunset, but I like to think of this as the sunrise, and that's just because I'm an optimist, and I think manatees are gonna tough it out and with all of this stuff going on. And so with that, I will wrap it up for any questions and specifics you might have. And I really enjoyed talking to you guys. Thank you so much. And I'm going to stop sharing the screen right now. Should I do that?
Yes, and if you could return me to host, that would be great.
Okay. Oh, okay. So, and that's, where is that?
So you go up to my name and it should say
Oh.
more, and you make me host.
Oh, wait, where's your name?
Yeah, I'm at the top, Paul Benatia.
I don't have you anymore at the top of my list. Let me go through.
Well, probably, I'm alphabetical then.
Let's see, Paul. Oh, darn, sorry about that. Let's see.
I would be after Patty Wetstein.
Wow, I can't.
If you can't find me, I think it'll work.
Oh yeah, you're at the end. Okay, so and make list. Okay, sorry. Yeah, got it.
Okay,
Okay, sorry, Paul.
that's it.
Thank you, everybody, for bearing with me. I appreciate it. And next time I want to come down and talk to you guys.
Hey, Bob.
Yes.
Bob, could you tell everybody the story about the time you put on the green wetsuit?
Oh, well, it was that was my swimsuit. And I kind of told that story a little bit about the floppy suits that I had. I had a yellow pair and a blue pair and a green pair. And I'd be okay when I got in the water with the yellow pair, just dangle in front of the manatees, they would ignore me. And the blue pair, it would just ignore me. But when I put on that leafy green vegetation in the water, they knew right away, and they'd come up and they'd try to rip it right off of me. And so that was one, it was instructive. It told me maybe I shouldn't be wearing a wetsuit or a swimsuit that's green in company of manatees. But it also told us that maybe they can see color. And if you're a manatee and you're gonna focus on something and you're a herbivore, it doesn't get any better than green. So when I get in the water with manatees, we have a green shirt on, and I put that shirt on, it says Manatee Research in the back, and it identifies us because we have permits that allow us to do things around manatees, go under the water and those kinds of things, that allow us to do things that people that are swimming with manatees can't do. And they'll come right up to it and start chewing on my arm, trying to pull my shirt off. And we picked green because we knew that we wouldn't startle a manatee. In fact, we would invoke some curiosity, and being the smart animals that they were, they rewarded us by letting us do this.
Bob, I have a question for you.
Yes.
I'm a boater, usually on the Caloosahatchee River, and when we're going slow in a boat, is it the sound, or is it the motion of the boat that
It's I think it's a little bit of both, Paul. I think they can key in on the sound. They hear sounds really well. If we take a dive communicator, that little cricket thing, and put it in the water and it trained a manatee to come to it, it can come from pretty much 300 or 400 yards away and right straight line to that clicker. And so I know they're hearing the frequency of that clicker, and it's about 400 kilohertz or 400 hertz. And they said, well, manatees can't hear below 1,000 hertz, the publications that were done, but I know they hear it at 400. So they can key in on the sound and get good localization on it, because they can use their head like an antenna if they're hearing the sound. And they can use their body in the echolocation, picking up vibrations. In fact, they can also detect inanimate objects in the water. So if your boat stops, or if there's a rock in their muddy water that they're swimming through, they can essentially feel vibrations coming off that rock and go around it. Whereas we would bump into the tree log or something in the water for pursuing or following a manatee, and it's going through a maze of stuff, we're getting snagged up in things all the time when we're in that water with them. So I think it's a combination of both. Now, I think some people say, well, if you go slow, they can't hear you, so is it better to go fast? I disagree. I think if you go slow, they're going to have a better ability to detect you.
Right.
You just have to imagine that if their detection is limited to picking up, sounds like this and processing it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, and you're a manatee that lives in the water, and you have to go to the surface and break the surface to get a breath while you're half asleep or not as cognizant, the chances of being hit are pretty great, as if you keep putting more and more traffic up at the surface of these boats. So I think manatees in general, extremely good at avoiding boats. So if you're idling down, going down, and you don't veer sharp or turn sharp or go directly, at them purposely, they're going to do what's necessary to get out of the way. And I think they do that 99.9% of the time. It's that 0.1% where they get clobbered and they either end up with a non-lethal scar or they end up dying. And that's usually when they die, it's a big boat going pretty fast through the water. So I'm pretty convinced of that. And I think a lot of it is our behavior too. If we started to change our behavior when we're driving and drive on the sidewalk where people are standing, people wouldn't agree with that very much, wouldn't go over very well. Well, manatees feel the same way. If you stay in the channel where you're designated and they know that and they understand that, they'll avoid that area, or they'll take more precautions in that area. You'll catch them off guard just like you would if you were driving your car through a bus stop with people standing on the side of the road. Manatees are out in the grass feeding. Don't zip across the shallows through the seagrasses. or you're going to increase the likelihood or probability of hitting a manatee.
Thank you.
And they do become a bit complacent. You know, they are a creature of habit. If getting your food every day and tells you to go to point A, you're going to go to point A. If boats start going over point A, somebody's going to get hit and you're going to have to go to point B, and then you're safe until boats start going over point B. You know, so it's a process of learning this stuff and what works best with them. It's frightening that it's an overload because you have to process so much information all the time. And you can imagine what it's like to hold your breath and biologically and physiologically need to go to the surface to get a breath. You're required to, or you're going to drown. But weigh the effects of going between a boat that's coming fast, but I'll just make it. You know, I mean, it's all a gamble. It's tough stuff. And they do pretty well at negotiating that, but you know, we're not all rocket scientists.
How
I have a
about
question.
outside?
Hi, I'm Marianne Barker. I have a question.
Uh-huh.
I live near Rosen Park, and right now we have a boat ramp that has been cordoned off because we have like 8 to 10 manatees that have been hanging
Ah.
around for about a week, mating,
Wow.
and you know. And
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, why would they choose a cement, you know, with cement walls and a cement ramp, you know, coming down? Why?
Yeah, they're, you know, they might prefer natural and seagrass shore, but manatees are so adaptable. They can live with cement seawalls. You know, it just, they really, what I think maybe attracts them to that point is, one, there's probably some fresh water nearby that they
Okay.
know to get. There's probably a female that's in estrus that swims through
Oh,
there.
yeah.
It's a narrow area. And when she goes through, the males are all attracted to her. And it's deep enough water that they can get down below any kind of traffic in the canal and that kind of thing. So to a manatee, it's safer to be in deeper water than it is to be on the flats. And they'll do a lot of their resting in 8 to 10 feet of water, you know, if where it's going to be safer for them to hunker down and sleep than it would be to sleep more vulnerable at the surface somewhere else.
Right.
And so it's probably just out of, maybe the water is a little warmer there too. There could be other things associated with that could impact the judgment of why they selected that space. But it's,
Yeah.
does FWC know about the site, and has their local biologists been there to kind of take pictures and ascertain what they're
Well, I
doing?
know the park system they've cordoned it off, so they're
Yeah.
keeping the boats out of there, which is
No, that's
great. So
good.
they're very well aware of it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. And the more public education you get, you know, again, it's building that advocacy for manatees. I would be the first person to say, don't go swim with manatees in Crystal River if I thought it was causing harm to manatees. But I think every single person that gets in that water and comes out of it, or goes to visit them at Homosassa and just look at them in the environment or any of the facilities, leaves those places with a better attitude about what's going on the planet around them. And I think that's a real valuable kind of experience that I think people will share for a long, long time. So any kind of education is great. I mean, when I was in school, it had A for apple and M for monkey. And then when my kids were in elementary school, it was a long time ago, but it, you know, was, you know, not that long ago, but the A was still the apple. But guess what? The monkey was gone and there was a manatee on the chalkboard. So that's pretty cool. You know, times change and perceptions change, and you can't go wrong with a manatee because they're endearing. They're the most passive creature on the planet. They don't have incisors. They're not going to bite you. If they get afraid, they swim away. If it doesn't work, they swim away farther and faster. You know, they avoid any kind of conflict. They're really pretty incredible animals. We have a lot.
Yeah,
to
they're
learn
really
from them.
fun to watch. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
We have time for one more question, Alicia.
Yes, hi. Thank
Hi.
you so much, Bob. What is your take on the propellers, on the guard that goes around the propeller?
Yeah, good. That's a good. Well, we practiced with propeller guards back in the day in Crystal River, and fuel consumption went up. But you know, that would be a price you wouldn't mind paying if it had some benefit to it. But it turns out that they were more difficult to maneuver the boat, and it was less. So it was more dangerous in that regard to use the boat. We had no problem. I never hit a manatee in Crystal River, and I always just went slow. And if I put a prop guard on and got the wrong idea that I was making it safe for manatees and went a little bit faster, I'd probably hit more manatees, and then the guard would scrape against them and bump them and break bones and that kind of thing. So I don't really think they are the solution. I think the solution is keeping the boats, just like we keep our cars on the highways, keep the boats in the channels. And if it says, you know, you can go through here at this speed, don't deviate away from that, because manatees, being the creature of habit, they're going to learn, but they won't learn from our mistakes. You know, we have to learn from that, and we have to correct that. But manatees are going to have to realize and not fear being out on the flats where they have to be to get their seagrass and weigh that against the fear of one person ruining it for everybody and going fast through there. So I think enforcement is a big issue. I think going in the proper speed in the proper areas that are designated, stay out of the no entry zones, and don't be erratic in your boating behavior. If you're going from here to there, don't be zigzagging around or, you know, not paying attention to what's going on, because they're underwater trying to track you the whole way. And it's, you know, they're good at doing it, but again, you wouldn't want to be clobbered by a boat coming at you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob. We
Yeah, it was my
appreciated
pleasure.
your talk.
Well, thanks very much, guys, and
Yes, thank
anytime.
you.
All right, and if you have any more questions, Eric or Lori, you can just forward them to me or something, and I'll answer them for you.
Thank you
Sure.
again.
Great, thanks, guys.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.